All right, so let's look at the content of a bio, what I'm calling these puzzle pieces. There are two categories of puzzle pieces. One is factual pieces, and the other I'm calling fancy pieces. There's 6 total puzzle pieces that you might choose to include in a bio. They can go in any order. You don't have to include all of them, and you can sort of pick and choose which ones you use, although there are norms for sort of formal context. So we're going to go into that. So here's the factual pieces. The first is your name and what you are or what you do. Those 2 pieces absolutely need to be in a bio. Those are 100% have to be there sort of things. But where you're based and where you come from don't have to be there. Just if you feel like it's relevant to what you do and it's important information for your audience. If they want to know like what city you're based in, then that should be there. Number 2, your education or your training, if you've got formal education or training. If you don't, that's perfectly fine. Just leave out this puzzle piece, and you can choose to put in the adjective self-trained into that first sentence if you want. So when you're defining yourself, like, you know, Bethany McLemore Stewart is a self-trained blah, 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 blah. If you want to, you don't have to though. The third puzzle piece is your accomplishments or career highlights puzzle piece that might be important or relevant to the audience that you're writing to. Now, this is where you're going to be taking a category from your resume and turning it into a sentence. So let's say that I'm an artist and my exhibitions section is my most impressive section of my artist resume. Then in my bio for this puzzle piece, I'm going to say, Bethany Stewart has exhibited both around the country and internationally, including at blah, 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 blah. And you can include 2 or 3 examples from that category that you choose to summarize in a sentence in your bio. Let's say that I have a lot of awards that I've won. I'm a musician and I've won all kinds of awards. Then I'll say, you know, Bethany Stewart has won several awards, including blah, 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 right? Just in the list. And that's it, right? That's a really easy section to write just because you're choosing something that you've already created, maybe if you have a resume already created, and just turning it into a sentence. Fourth puzzle piece, what you're currently working on. And this is something that I would suggest comes last because it just leaves the bio in sort of an open place, showing that you're still busy and you're still relevant and you're still doing things. So that would be a great thing to come at the very end. All right, so those are our factual pieces that if you're writing for a formal context, I would advise sticking to these or at least including these. Here are the fancy pieces. So if you're writing for an informal context or a formal context with a longer limit and you have the space to add these in. The 5th is your influences or your inspirations. Now, this is going to verge onto the artist statement territory. So if you are submitting an artist statement alongside this bio, I would just encourage you to make sure that there's not any overlap in the 2 documents. That doesn't mean you can't talk about your inspirations or influences, but you might just do it very briefly if you've covered it in your artist statement or in a slightly different way. And then that last puzzle piece is what I get asked about sometimes, which is a unique, insightful, or funny personal detail about your life without being cutesy. Now, you'll see a lot of times, like on people's websites, they might end their bio by saying like something personal about themselves, like, you know, Bethany has 2 kids and a hound dog or something like that, or likes to bake on the weekends or whatever it is, something like cutesy like that. Now that for a website, that is perfectly fine. And I think that that's cute and fun and gives the reader a little bit of insight into what you do. You know your audience, and you know if that's something that they would like to be included on your website. However, for a formal context, I would not do that. Now, that doesn't mean you can't add anything personal. This is your bio after all, but I'll show you ways of writing an interesting thing about yourself while tying it into the rest of the content of the bio, because that's the important thing here. You need to have it be a cohesive piece of writing for a formal context, and having a sentence at the end that just says a lot of things that are seemingly unrelated to my art doesn't fit, right? It doesn't work. And so I would say great for a website, but not for like submitting alongside an application. All right, so how you choose what puzzle pieces to include depends on your length requirement, of course. So here's a little guide. If you're asked for like a 50-word bio or even a 75-word bio, all you have space to do is cover 3 or 4 of those puzzle pieces. That's really it. And if it's for a formal context, that means you're really limited to those factual pieces. There's 4 of them. You'll probably just want to stick to that. That's not hard and fast because let's say you don't have a formal education. It might be great to go ahead and write a sentence about your influences or mention them in half of a sentence or something like that, which is one of the fancy pieces, but could work for you to sort of meet that 50 words. But you really don't have much space, and you're going to see how hard it is to cover those bases in 50 words when we see the examples. If you have 100 words, though, you can add in one of the fancy pieces. And I would say for a formal audience, make it that inspiration and influences fancy piece. And this way you can let your personality show a bit because you have 25 extra words to work with. And you're able to get your voice in there a little bit more. If you have more than 100 words, then you're lucky and you're going to feel like 150 words is just all the space in the world after tonight. But you'll be able to include 6 puzzle pieces if you want. You don't have to include that personal story or funny story piece if you don't want to. You can just elaborate more on the other 5. But if you want to, you have the space to do it and to do it well. All right, a couple other things to consider when you're trying to decide which puzzle pieces to include in a bio. So length requirement is one of them. You just can only do so much with 50 words. But if you have more words to work with, you can do a lot more. Your audience, like I said, formal audience, try to stick with the facts. Informal audience, you can mix fact with fancy at whatever length. So even if it's a 50-word bio, but it's an informal audience, you don't necessarily have to stick with the facts. And we'll see that in a minute. Consider your own personal style and voice. Maybe you're writing for an informal context and you're like, I don't want to write about just the facts. It's too stuffy and it's too dry. It doesn't sound like me. Then obviously you're going to want to choose some of those fancy categories to work in. The details of your career. Like I said, if you don't have a formal education, then you're not going to use that puzzle piece. If you don't have a really extensive experience and you'd rather talk about your inspirations and your influences, that's great too. And maybe spend more time in that case talking too about what you're working on now or what you're going to work on soon, so that it shows what the work that you're doing, even if you don't have exhibitions in your history. And then what is covered in other documents that you're including alongside the bio. And I mentioned this already, but try not to overlap with other documents submitted in the same packet or even shared in your website. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later. Might there be alternate puzzle pieces? Sure, I'm open to the fact that there might be other things that I've not thought of that might pop up commonly in biographies or just occasionally in biographies that you like and you think would fit you as an artist really well. So maybe if you can think of something like that, or you've already thought of something like that, you can bring it up in the questions and we can talk about that. But these are definitely the ones that are most common. So we're going to discuss different scenarios and what puzzle pieces you might choose for those scenarios.